Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a truly fascinating and honestly unexpected intersection, the clash between deep-rooted century-old history and underground hip-hop. We so often think of history as this static thing, basically just confined to dusty textbooks. But today, we're going to see how decades-old political struggles are actively being fought right now out loud over drum loops and synthesized beats in Italy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Can hip-hop actually be a political battleground? Hip-hop is obviously a massive global phenomenon, and we know it was initially born from marginalized voices in the US as a pure form of expression and resistance. But here's the thing. When that culture crossed the Atlantic and took root in Italy, it mutated into something else entirely. It became this highly charged proxy battlefield for the historical divides that have fractured Italian society for the last century. And to really understand how rap music became a political weapon, we first have to understand the historical weapons being wielded.
That brings us to Section 1, the roots of anti-fascism and the ancient origins of a very modern conflict. To really grasp this cultural clash, we have to start by establishing our macro-historical context. Let's look at the visual etymology of the word fascism. It's actually rooted in ancient Roman authority. The fasces, which is where the word comes from, was a literal physical object. It was a bound bundle of wooden rods carried by Roman officials called lictors. It wasn't just a cool-looking symbol, either. It represented a magistrate's absolute, literal power to punish people and maintain order. It stood for the prestige and the unquestionable authority of the Roman Republic and later the Empire.
But how does an ancient Roman axe bundle turn into a 20th century political ideology? Well, by the time we hit the Renaissance, this ancient Roman symbol got tangled up with a really old Greek fable. The fable essentially warns that one single stick on its own snaps super easily, right? But if you take a group of those sticks and bind them tightly together into a bundle, they are completely unbreakable. So it became this incredibly powerful metaphor for harmony and unity and strength in numbers. And that exact symbol, that idea of unbreakable unity, is exactly what Italian fascism would later adopt to brand its entire movement in the 1900s.
Let's move to and see how this builds chronologically. Fascism emerges as this far-right, ultranationalistic ideology around the 1910s, but it almost immediately sparked a massive reaction. By 1922, it became the state ideology in Italy under Mussolini, and by 1933 in Germany under Hitler. But look closely at the 1920s on our timeline. Organized anti-fascist pushback started forming right alongside it. In Italy, militant opposition groups like the RDD del Popolo emerged to combat this surge way before the actual outbreak of World War II in 1939.
Moving into Section 2, revolutionary versus counter-revolutionary. Let's look at two completely different paths of anti-fascist thought.
It's really easy to just think of anti-fascism as one big unified group, but historian Michael Seidman actually provides a breakdown showing two totally distinct ideological camps here. On the left, you had revolutionary anti-fascism. This was driven largely by communists and anarchists, and they viewed both fascism and capitalism as the ultimate enemies. To them, fascism was really just another shade of right-wing authoritarianism. But on the right, you had counter-revolutionary anti-fascism. Think of conservative figures here, like Winston Churchill or Charles de Gaulle. They definitely weren't looking to start a revolution. They wanted to defeat fascism so they could restore the traditional pre-war regime and protect the distinct boundaries of public and private life that fascism was actively trying to erase.
However, despite those massive ideological differences, and they were massive, both the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary factions actually shared some absolutely crucial common ground during World War II. First, both recognized that violent expansion was literally baked right into the fascist project. Second, both completely rejected the idea that the Versailles Treaty caused the conflict, instead blaming fascist dynamism. And finally, both sides buckled down and prepared for a long, grueling struggle, actively creating a shared cult of heroism to motivate the masses against a common enemy.
Which brings us to Section 3, Italy's 90s posse movement and the musical resistance in squatted centers.
So you might be wondering, why does all this 1940s history even matter for a music explainer? Well, we are zooming straight into 1990s Italy to see how these exact anti-fascist ideals found a brand new voice. A totally unique subculture exploded on the scene, known as the posse movement. Young people and university students began taking over abandoned buildings. These were squatted centers known locally as centri sociali. And these physical spaces became the incubators for a uniquely Italian underground music scene. They weren't just throwing cool parties in abandoned warehouses. They were actively utilizing these centers to spread militant, highly political, and explicitly anti-fascist messages.
So the crucial point is how these groups actually operated, both musically and politically. Bands like the famous 99 Posse essentially picked up the baton right where the militant Italian singer-songwriters of the 1970s left off, but they completely updated the sound. They were actively merging rap with foreign influences like reggae and punk rock. Lyrically, they were razor sharp. They actively called out Italian youth for a lack of anti-fascist activism, and they fiercely denounced the mainstream parliamentary left for abandoning its revolutionary ideals. Essentially, they turned these centri sociali into loud, echoing megaphones for the revolutionary anti-fascist tradition we talked about just a minute ago.
That evolution takes us to Section 4, the rise of literature rap and using storytelling as a modern weapon.
As we transition into the late 2000s, the lyrical tactics within this scene really evolved. It went from that raw, punk-infused energy into something much more sophisticated. Enter literatura rap, which directly translates to literature rap. This is just a fascinating subgenre of Italian hip-hop. Artists like Kento and Mirabutu became the highly influential representatives of this brand new, very literate style. Instead of just shouting political slogans over a heavy beat, their music is characterized by incredibly complex metaphors and deeply structured fictional storytelling.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the battlefield changed over time. Kento and Mirabutu still oppose contemporary forms of fascism, but not through direct, in-your-face aggression. Instead, they use intricate short stories and fictional characters. They craft these vivid narratives that illustrate the historical and moral importance of resistance. It's almost like a meta technique, you know? They're fighting this ideological war on a deeply cultural and intellectual level, proving that a 3-minute rap verse can actually carry the exact same weight as a dense historical novel.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this specific lyric. If I see a black dot, I shoot it on sight. To put that into perspective, this line is heavily laden with historical context. In Italy, black directly refers to the traditional uniform color worn by Italian fascists. So it perfectly showcases the visceral, unyielding intensity of this clash. Even when it's wrapped up in all these clever literary metaphors, the absolute core of the music remains a fierce, militant rejection of fascist ideology.
Now for Section 5, Neo-Fascist Hip-Hop Appropriation, Rewriting the Cultural Script.
So here is where the story takes a wild turn. If hip-hop was such an effective tool for the left-wing resistance, what happens when the other side decides to pick up the microphone? Well, we see a highly calculated, strategic maneuver. Neo-fascist political groups in Italy, most notably an organization called Casa Pound, recognized the immense, undeniable power of hip-hop to organize and recruit huge numbers of young people. So, rather than fighting against the culture, they began a very concerted effort to appropriate it for themselves. They sought to leverage this art form, one that was traditionally built by marginalized voices, to spread right-wing political ideologies. How exactly did they pull this off? Casa Pound used some very specific, deliberate methods to establish a foothold in the hip-hop scene. First, they organized street art conventions that were specifically centered around graffiti to attract urban youth. Then, they actively promoted the emergence of their very own right-wing hip-hop crews. A prime example of this is their heavy support for Rome-based rap groups like Drick Darkcore. It was a completely systematic attempt to rewrite the cultural script and claim a space within the very subculture that had been explicitly targeting them for decades.
Taking a step back from the music for a second, this appropriation reveals a profound crisis in traditional political ideologies. The mere fact that a single musical genre can be utilized by squatter communist posses in the 90s and then seamlessly co-opted by neo-fascist recruitment drives in the 2000s just demonstrates the extreme malleability of hip-hop. It shows us a much broader shift in how modern youth are being influenced today. They're influenced less by traditional, stuffy political parties and a whole lot more by the power of social movements to completely reinvent and weaponize subcultures.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. Who truly owns a subculture? When a musical genre that was literally born from resistance is used as a tool by both ends of the extreme political spectrum, does the music belong to its origins, or does it just belong to whoever happens to be holding the microphone? It is a complex, constantly evolving relationship between art, history, and political identity in Italy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep seeking out the structure and the chaos, and I will see you next time.